Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're revisiting a conversation recorded in 2021 about the complex grief experienced after losing a loved one to suicide. While some circumstances have changed, the topic remains deeply relevant and urgent. Suicide remains a leading cause of death in the United States and a preventable public health issue. In 2023, nearly 49,000 individuals died by suicide, maintaining the historically high levels seen in 2022. That's about 132 lives lost each day, and behind every one of those deaths is a network of grieving loved ones. About 90% of the people who die by suicide had a diagnosable mental health condition at the time of their death, underscoring how deeply mental illness and suicide are connected. For every suicide death, many more people experience suicidal thoughts or attempts, further highlighting the widespread impact on families, friends, coworkers, classmates, teachers, and entire communities. These untimely deaths leave a wake of complicated grief and pain for everyone who loved and cared for that person. It can be confusing, isolating, and feel like a grief that's impossible to survive. And it can be incredibly hard to talk about. Yet the more we personally know and are able to talk about suicide, the more equipped we are to help someone who may be at risk or support someone who has had this kind of loss. That's why we're returning to this powerful conversation with Leslie Nielsen, a mother learning to live with the loss of her adult son to suicide, and Carly Memoli, a longtime suicide prevention specialist who at the time of this recording was the program director for Suicide Prevention Service of the Central Coast. This interview was originally part of a two-part series on suicide, so we encourage you to also check out episode 34, which focused on suicide prevention for teens and young adults. Please note, this conversation includes personal stories and frank discussion of suicide and mental illness. It may not be suitable for all listeners. If you or someone you know is struggling, help is available. Call or text the Suicide Crisis Lifeline at 988 anytime, day or night. Here's more about our guests. Leslie Nielsen has lived in the Bay Area her entire life, working in Silicon Valley as a finance professional while raising two children, Ben and Nicole. Her now husband, Jim Duzak, referred to as her partner during the original recording, has been part of their lives for over 24 years. Now retired from the tech world, Leslie splits her time between McCall, Idaho, and Capitola, California. She's been active with the Santa Cruz chapter of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, teaching classes for people who have loved ones with mental illness, classes she first took herself after her son experienced his first mental health crisis. Her personal experience and strong belief in advocacy, empathy, and the ending of the silence are helping her find meaning in the challenges of her son Ben's all-too-short life, which ended in early 2021. Also with us is Carly Memoli, a longtime suicide prevention specialist with over 2 decades of experience in community mental health. At the time of this recording, she was serving as the program director for Suicide Prevention Service of the Central Coast. Today, Carly continues her work as a consultant and trainer, providing evidence-based education in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. She's a master trainer in applied suicide intervention skills training, assist, safe talk, and mental health first aid. Welcome, Leslie and Carly, to State of Mind.
Thank you so much for having me today, Deb.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm so glad to be here.
I am too. And I'm thinking, Carly, why don't we get started with you? I'm wondering if you can describe how frequent deaths by suicide occur on a global, national, and local level And, what are the numbers and what kind of, how many people are we talking about here?
Sure. It's a big question. And, I also just want to note for anyone that's listening that as we're talking about some of this today, we're talking about numbers, but each of those numbers are people, and the loss of one person affects so many people in such profound, traumatic ways. And just for the listeners, if someone has lost an individual in their life to suicide death or is struggling, that help is available through the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and other resources that we'll talk about today. I wanted to just talk briefly about the big picture. One of the challenges in designing effective community suicide prevention and post-prevention, meaning after a suicide death programs, is really understanding the scope of the problem. And like many other public health issues, suicide is actually difficult to capture accurate data on. We are finally in California working with our public health and mental health departments and our local epidemiologists to be able to gather up-to-date and accurate data on suicide loss and death, on suicide attempts, and even suicidal ideation using a wide range of tools, including the California Healthy Kids Survey and a wide variety of other sources. It's really important for us to understand the contributing factors when we talk about suicide. You mentioned a little bit about mental health and undiagnosed mental health issues, or folks that are diagnosed but perhaps not receiving, the proper treatment. There's any number of factors that can contribute, but the more that we know, the better we can do. And really what we're trying to do is identify all of those risk factors and also the protective factors so that together our community can really embrace the idea that suicide prevention is everyone's business and that there are many ways that we can all help make a difference. We also feel that it's everyone's business because in some way, shape, or form, we're all likely to be touched by suicide in some way in our lives. Across the globe, there are between 800,000 and 1 million recorded suicides annually. That's a lot of people. We know from a report that the Centers for Disease Control released in, I want to say it was 2 years ago, that from 1999 to 2016, the national suicide rate increased over 25%. And that was in every single state except for Nevada. Don't think they're doing anything magical in Nevada necessarily, but there's a number of factors that play into that. And as you touched on earlier, in 2018, there were an estimated 1.4 million suicide attempts and more than 48,000 deaths by suicide in the United States, making it the 10th leading cause of death across age groups. Now, we can talk a little bit more about certain age groups or different demographic groups that might be higher at risk. We also recognize that suicide is one of those issues in particular that is still very difficult for us to talk about as a society, partially because of the stigma around this. Most people are pretty stunned to learn that there are twice as many deaths from suicide as homicide. And that for certain higher risk groups, police officers, veterans, others that do first responder work, more individuals die by suicide than in the line of duty. So this isn't just an issue that impacts one sector or one group. We know that locally, in the area that my program works with, which is Santa Cruz County, Monterey County, and San Benito County, we've also seen an increase in suicides in recent years. Overall, both Santa Cruz and Monterey County are below the statewide average, but not by much. And this is kind of that territory where some folks want to say, well, it's not that many people. And we think that one person is too many. Yeah, I saw Leslie raised her eyebrows at that. And I thought, yeah, that's how I feel too. There is a lot of work being done around this concept of zero suicides and how do we get there? And I'm not sure that we ever will, but I want to know that we've done everything that we possibly can to normalize the experience that people may have suicidal thoughts and feelings. And that what we want to try to do is help people to have alternatives and other options to not act on those thoughts and feelings so that they can live through a suicidal crisis. And there's no one way to do that.
And not so much fear about talking to someone about it.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely.
So it's my understanding that death by suicide often leads to what we clinically call complicated grief. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly describe what that is and how it can differ from other grief.
Absolutely. Suicide grief is grief from the loss of a loved one to suicide is, in my experience as a fellow suicide loss survivor, is very different than many other kinds of loss. People experience grief in many different ways. And unfortunately, in our society, we don't deal with mortality or grief very well. Most of the time, if you lose an immediate family member, you get 3 days of bereavement leave. And that's not really enough. And that's not really how it works. Grief has its own timeline and its own pace. And what we see is that, and I want to be real cautious here to say that everyone's experience is unique. And so I can speak in generalities from the work that I've done. And I'm excited to hear Leslie's story and just honored to be able to hear directly from someone on that today, because everyone's experience is different. So if what I'm sharing doesn't ring true for your experience or anyone that's listening, like that, it will just enrich our understanding and knowledge of the issue and also the impact. What we've seen is that sometimes individuals who experience a loss to suicide have a very different experience. Suicide loss doesn't always bring people together in the same way that a loss from an illness or an accident might. People don't show up with casseroles as much. It's more traumatic, whether it was expected or not expected. There is often blame or shame or guilt. One of the reasons that some individuals who've lost loved ones to suicide embrace the term survivors of suicide loss is because it's a significant traumatic experience. And the isolation that results, partially because people don't know what to say. And so sometimes they say nothing, and sometimes they leave survivors alone to grief in isolation. A lot of the time we see that people are really sometimes get stuck with engaging around the healing process because the act itself of what happened is just so unthinkable. And understandably, we may spend years wrestling with that question of why did this happen and what could have been done. And while we might do the same if we lose someone to an illness, we don't typically say, well, I should have stopped that, or you should have done something about that, or didn't you notice the warning signs? And I think that there's, from the people that I've worked with, I also see that there's a lot of feelings that people experience after a suicide loss that are sort of off limits, it's not as safe to share those. We might be really angry at the person who killed themselves. We might feel guilt or shame. We may feel really angry at other systems of care that maybe didn't do enough. When you were talking about the larger percentage of individuals with serious mental health issues who die by suicide, we also can look at last year, the majority of states and communities in the United States did not have sufficient behavioral health care for people in the communities who needed it.
Thank you. That gives a good picture. You've been listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're revisiting a powerful conversation originally recorded in 2021 about the complicated grief that follows the loss of a loved one to suicide. You may hear some references to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was still unfolding at the time. While circumstances have changed, the themes remain deeply relevant. In this episode, I speak with Carly Memoli, who at the time was Program Director for Suicide Prevention Service of the Central Coast. Carly has since gone on to work as a consultant and trainer in the field of suicide prevention. I'm also joined by Leslie Nielsen, whose adult son died by suicide early in 2021. In the interview, she refers to her partner Jim. He's now her husband and has been part of their lives for over 24 years. Stay with us to learn more about complicated grief and how someone begins to bear the pain and go on living. Now, back to our interview. Leslie, I want to thank you so much for coming today and talking about this really difficult topic. My hope is that in talking about this, we might help others going through similar kinds of experiences. So can you tell us about what was going on in your son's life and how that led to his death by suicide?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. I also very much appreciate Carly's comments on how different this kind of grief is on a comparative basis to grief from losses not due to suicide. And that's why I'm here doing this, is wanting to talk about it. And getting people comfortable with and used to the idea of talking about this very difficult thing to talk about. Quick background, what led up to Ben's suicide. I'd like to just very briefly share before his suicide that he was an amazing and healthy, thriving young man until he had his first acute manic episode in late 2018. Ben was a Division I ice hockey player. He got a full ride scholarship to Miami University of Ohio. He was the Scholar Athlete of the year he graduated, double majored in entrepreneurial business and film studies. He was just an amazing, well-launched young man who went to USC for film school, master's program. And it was there in his third and final year approaching graduation that he had this acute manic episode. And we got the call that something was really wrong with Ben and needed to come to LA. We did. And we've been on a journey ever since with early hospitalization and diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder with bipolar subtype. And along with that, psychosis. And I always like to define psychosis for people, which seems like a very common word, but it's just the concept of being out of touch with reality. And in my relationship with Ben, in the ensuing 2 years after he became ill, we were in two different realities. So I built a relationship with a new Ben and tried to meet him where he was and understand what it must be like to be going through some of the things that he was going through in his life. In addition, one of the symptoms that comes with mental illness at times is a word that's difficult to pronounce, anosognosia, which is simply the lack of understanding or awareness or acceptance that you have a condition like this. So think of it as a lack of insight. And that made it so difficult to try to help Ben, was his lack of insight into his illness. In Ben's case, it manifested itself in religious delusions and grandiose delusions. So not very long after his first hospitalization, and we all know a lot about the 72-hour hold and how hard it is to get them help after that. It's where the family kicks in and helps as much as they can. He ended up joining the Hare Krishna movement. He moved into the ashram at the temple in LA. And after about a year, his grandiose delusions made him believe that he was more exalted than he really was, and perhaps even better than the people running the temple with respect to what he thought needed to happen in the spiritual world of others. And so he moved out into an apartment down the street from the ashram and lived very independently, cooked for himself, kept his house clean, shopped, exercised, yoga mastered, just lived a very seemingly healthy, independent life. But we all knew the brain disorder was not a healthy brain. I would visit Ben frequently. COVID greatly impacted my ability to do that. Zoom was a beautiful thing. We had a lot of visits that way. In October of 2020, so just a year ago, was the last time I saw Ben. I went down to visit and had figured out pretty quickly when I got there that he had an attempted suicide. So in my knowledge of mental illness, I knew we would have perhaps manic episodes and depressed episodes. And we did end up talking a lot about that in October last year. I had discussions with him, LA County Mental Health, LA Police, family. We were constantly trying to figure out how to intervene in Ben's life in a way we could be helpful. We had calls, text, emails. He was engaging, but the mood swings were clear in these ongoing conversations. In mid-January of this year, 2021, Ben was pretty angry. In my individual conversation with him, I could feel it. And then later, in looking back at a lot of his correspondence with people, I could see it. He was angry with the world. He was angry with everyone in mid-January. I was lucky enough to have a beautiful phone conversation with Ben on January 27th for 2 hours. And it was a gift. And Ben seemed so like he was doing so well. And we've heard sometimes that when they seem to be doing their best is when they're organized enough to follow through with their suicidal ideology. And in Ben's case, that appears to be what happened. And we got the call on February 2nd that Ben had taken his own life. He was found by the LA police in his apartment. He had hung himself from the bunk bed facing a poster of Krishna.
So sorry, Leslie, so hard.
Thank you.
You know, being a parent myself, I know, I mean, just the thought of losing a child at any age is just so hard and really almost unimaginable for parents. What about his death by suicide do you think makes it particularly hard?
Wow, you're so right, Deborah. At any age and by whatever means, the loss is tragic and something so unnatural to outlive a child. What layers on, if you will, to the loss when it's from suicide is the ambiguity and the discomfort for so many who find it difficult to show empathy. The why question takes on such a different meaning than when the cause of death is clearly understood. And, you know, Carly touched on this. What could you have done? Could you have done more? When someone dies of stage 4 cancer, it's tragic. And the parents don't feel any less pain about that loss. But there's no question that, rarely is there any question that medicine and science and people did everything that they could. And this does make the grieving process, a lot more difficult. I also heard Carly mention no one brings you a casserole. And that is something I learned when Ben got sick. I reached out to one of my best friends and had lost touch with her over the years and knew that she was having challenges with her son for years. And the first thing she said to me was, get used to the ride you're going to be on because it's not a casserole illness. It's just hard for people to reach out in the same way they do with other things. And studies have shown that a family grieving after a death by suicide does receive less support. There's a false belief that the loved one brought this on themselves, and this notion of perhaps not being worthy of being mourned. And that's really painful for the survivor to feel that from the way your outreach is happening. So I guess to summarize, the cause of Ben's death has left me feeling lonely in my grief. I will have to add on, though, I'm constantly trying to chase the sunshine around this situation and the support of those closest to me, my partner, Jim, Ben's sister, Nicole, my sister. It's just been amazing. And they've been my rock. And there's just no way I could have gotten through this without them.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up because, that's exactly why I sit in this chair and do this program, because of what you said about mental illness and our need to get more comfortable since it touches everyone's life, and so many people are holding that pocket of their life sort of in secrecy or privacy because of all of the things that you mentioned. So really appreciate you bringing that up. I'm also really interested in what impact did you see this having on other family members, and or close friends, his death by suicide?
Such a great question, Deborah. And I have to say, it's been eye-opening, absolutely eye-opening. I'm not surprised by the closeness that it has created for those closest to me. And I have such a loving relationship with my partner, Jim. I call him my husband. We're domestic partners, but he's Nicole's, dad, and she loves him, and we have a great life. But this has just really cemented this bond between us, the three of us, and also another person, my sister, Kim. The closeness that we've always had has become even more close than I thought it could be. So there's this sort of silver lining or goodness that comes from tragedy with respect to family bonds. And also with friends, learning the depth of character of your friends that you maybe didn't know as much about before, and you can see who has the ability to be part of this in a way that doesn't consume the friendship, but allows you to participate in it with them. It's also been difficult in cases where people have presented themselves in, I'll call it a less good way, with respect to what I felt I needed from them. And I've had to create boundaries with some people, in some cases, even feeling like it was toxic to stay involved in that person's life. Because I can't let them impede my journey of learning to live with my grief. And I kind of just declared that. I'm so lucky to have a lot of people in my life and acquaintances, but I now really need the people who don't give me pause with respect to any behaviors that will impede my journey. I'm too frail to do that. So that's been eye-opening from a how others are reacting to it perspective. And I really appreciate how scary it is for people, though. I do want to say that because I've had someone say, so-and-so said to send condolences. They haven't reached out or sent a card because it's too hard for them. I get it. I really do. It's learning that somebody died in a non-physical way from a brain disorder, and they were fine a mere 3 years ago. It's frightening.
Leslie, while it's said that many suicides are preventable, it's also true that some are not preventable. And I'm wondering how you've made sense of these two truths.
Yeah, there are so many contradictions, Deborah, as you've pointed out, in this complicated grief scenario. And I think perhaps an obvious conclusion about preventing suicide is when you do prevent it, you don't always know that you did. So there are some obvious times where you talked them in off the ledge, so to speak, and you knew that because you were there, they didn't jump. But there are also times where I reflect back on the phone calls and the sadness and the conversations and the trip to LA to think now is a good time to go down and see him. And wondering how many times I may have prevented Ben from making this tragic choice. And so, yeah, there's so many things I learned from going to the NAMI class immediately after Ben had his mental break. National Alliance for Mental Illness, the Santa Cruz chapter has a class, family to family. My partner, Jim, is a mental health clinician, worked up at UC Santa Cruz, and called them and said, we just found ourselves as parents of a child with mental illness and we need help. And they were amazing. And we got into this class, and it's not a support group, it's a structured curriculum. And it was amazing because to learn so much about what we were dealing with was powerful. And as a result of that, when the class was over, Jim and I were offered the opportunity to teach the class and became certified to teach the class and taught it twice. So I've been through the curriculum 4 times in 2 years. That saved my life. All of that information is what's helped me in my grief journey. And this question of suicide being prevented, yet I didn't prevent it, contradiction, I've been able to weather through my grief with almost no guilt. And I feel very fortunate that particular emotion is not one that is haunting me. I have plenty of others that are. Because I really do believe that I did everything that I could. And that the only person responsible for the decision Ben made that day is Ben. And sadly, with a brain disorder that didn't allow him to make great decisions.
Carly, I want to come to you because, what would you want our listeners to know about sort of these two contradictory and yet both true messages that while many suicides are preventable, some are not?
Right. I mean, I think a handful of things. And what Leslie shared, I think, is so powerful. Even from a program perspective, when we're asked to give data on, how many people died by suicide, no one ever asks how many people didn't because they talked to someone and got help, or how many people that did die didn't all the days previously because they had someone in their family that was there for them on some of the more difficult days. So I think that's really important. And again, it's one of the pitfalls of suicide loss is people really overly focus, because obviously it's a huge event. People overly focus on the day that the person actually died by suicide and try to interpret their life and who they were and their family relationships and what kind of life you gave your kid, like through that lens. And they are so much more than that loss. And yet they did die by suicide. So it is very confusing. I think a lot of the time people get stuck on this idea that, that person died by suicide because they hated their life or they didn't want to live. And I think for a lot of people, it's a mix. There's a part of that person that feels like, I can't do this anymore, no matter how much help I get from people. And there's probably a part of that person that still wants help. And which part's going to win out from day to day, it just depends on so many different things. So it's a lot to wrestle with. And I think we still have a ways to go to not blame ourselves or blame fellow survivors, but then also allow people to know that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. If part of what that person needs to move through is that feeling of, I should have done this, I needed to do this, then that's part of their grief process. And that's okay. We really get, I think, part of the isolation results from people policing one another's grief. You need to do it in this way or this time, or kind of in line with these very brief formal grieving rituals that we sometimes have. And we all become experts at truncating our pain, like denying and depressing our experience of loss. And that just enhances the suffering around it. So I think that I agree with a lot of what Leslie said. And I think we can't really resolve that conundrum. But for me, as a mental health and a public health service provider, that makes me want to go, okay, we need a full spectrum of things that we're attending to here in programming: prevention, intervention, postvention, and looking at all the different ways where we need to provide that support, because we don't want to leave those survivors without the support that they need. And there are a lot of innovative ways that we can do better in that area.
And I don't know that we can or need to resolve that conundrum. I think what we need to do is learn to hold those two truths as both true at the same time.
And I think, nobody will ever know the why and what Ben was thinking at that moment. And one of the things I found fascinating is all of the literature and podcasts and books and things that you can read and people you can talk to. There's a lot of focus on how dark the person had to have been when they made this choice. And I'm still searching. I'm only 8 months into this, and for more stories about something Jim said to me, which was very powerful, which was, Leslie, I think that Ben's psychosis prevented him from suffering. And in Ben's case, his religious delusions were getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And one psychiatrist that I talked to said, when the day comes where he says, I must be really sick and I need help, it may be a lot harder to get him back into our reality because he's getting so steeped into his reality. And his reality before he made this decision was, we are not this body, and I can do so much to save the world. And it seems like he went somewhere, not that he was so dark that he left. I think he was frustrated with his inability to turn all of us into Krishna conscious people. But I also think there's other lenses that you can put on the day based on what you know about so many days before that day about your loved one that can help you form a possible why answer that helps you feel more without fooling yourself at the same time.
You're tuned to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're revisiting a conversation first recorded in 2021. You may hear a few references to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was still unfolding at the time. But the topic we're discussing, complicated grief after the suicide of a loved one, remains as relevant and important today. Suicide has a wide-reaching impact. For every life lost, there's a web of people, parents, children, friends, coworkers, classmates, left behind to carry the emotional weight and unanswered questions. It's a pain that can feel isolating, confusing, and at times unbearable. In this episode, I'm talking with Leslie Nielsen, whose adult son, Ben, died by suicide in early 2021. Lisa refers to her partner, Jim, during the interview, but they've since married. Also with us is Carly Memoli, a longtime suicide prevention specialist. At the time of this recording, she was the program director for Suicide Prevention Service of the Central Coast. She has since continued her work in suicide prevention as a consultant and trainer in the field. Suicide can be hard to talk about, and this episode may be hard to listen to, but I want to encourage you to stay with us. Gaining a deeper understanding of suicide and how to talk about it may help you save a life or support someone living with this kind of loss. And remember, every State of Mind episode includes a detailed resource list, including those mentioned in today's program. You can find it on our show page at stateofmindmedia.org. If you or someone you know is struggling, help is available. Call or text the Suicide Crisis Hotline at 988, anytime, day or night. Now, back to our interview. I so appreciate what you're saying, and I'm just reflecting on so much of my own therapy work with people is helping them shape a meaning that is supportive and helpful. There are many possible meanings to choose from, and there's tons of data to support all of them. And, it's what you said is so powerful because you get to make the narrative about what the ending of Ben's life meant. And it clearly looks like you're choosing to do that in a way that is helpful.
Exactly. I've always, people who know me well, I've always said it's better to light one candle than complain about the dark. And I do try to frame scenarios in ways that create a more positive possibility.
That's so beautiful, Leslie. Thank you for sharing that. Just we get very stuck on the why and the rational, like what happened and why. But you're talking more about the story and the meaning and really holding space for not just the turmoil that Ben may have been experiencing, but the growth and, whether it was in this plane or this reality or elsewhere, he was experiencing something really profound, it sounds like. And many of us don't get there.
I don't even want to wrap up, but we're getting toward the end of our time. And I know that there may have been things that we didn't have a chance to get to. So we will have a complete resource list with a number of resources that our guests have mentioned today that will be posted along with the show on our KSQD website. But are there any of those resources that you would specifically want to call out and mention by name for our listeners? And Carly, can we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. And I have a feeling that Leslie's going to talk about NAMI, which we've worked with them for years. What an amazing resource. What a blessing to our community. So much good and healing and comfort and community building has come out of that in profound ways. There are a wide range of resources for survivors of suicide loss, and they're not all going to work for everybody. I would say the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the American Association of Suicidology have really excellent sections on their websites with a variety of tools, everything from a program called Healing Conversations, where survivors can request a phone call or an in-person meetup or a video meetup with another survivor, just to have a brief check-in and find some support. There's more tangible in-person, and some of it's still virtual right now. For our own program at Suicide Prevention Service, we have a few different things. I want to remind people that a lot of the time folks hear suicide prevention and they think, oh, the crisis line is for people who are suicidal. Our volunteers and staff are also trained to listen to and support people who are grieving a suicide loss. It's a significant portion of our calls, actually. And I encourage people to feel free to call. We answer calls both from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, so local callers who call the national number, and that's 1-800-273-8255. Again, it's 800-273-TALK, 8255. And we also have our local number, which is 877-663-5433. And if you don't have someone in your life that can be your, here's my code word, today is a bad day, that's why there are services like this. And it's never a bother. Doesn't matter if it's 3 a.m, doesn't matter if it's the third time today. That's what those supports are there for. There are also in-person support groups that are peer-based drop-in support groups for people who've lost a loved one to suicide. In Santa Cruz County, the group is called WINGS, which stands for Warm Interactions, Navigating Grief After Suicide. And for Monterey County, the group is LOSS, Loving Outreach for Suicide Survivors. And if someone is interested, they can go ahead and call the hotline or contact our office or go to our website at suicidepreventionservice.org. So there are a wide range of things out there. I would say take a look and see, and if you don't know where to start, call one of the local community resources and we can help you kind of get started in that process. Reach out to NAMI, reach out to suicide prevention, reach out to 211 even potentially if you don't know where else to start, and be gentle with yourself and know that you can survive. You may not think so, but you can, and that help and support is available. And while the world isn't set up necessarily to provide comfort and love and understanding for survivors of suicide loss, there are a lot of us out there who will hold that with you.
Leslie, any resources specifically that you want to call out? Probably not time to go through all of them, but any specific ones that you might want to.
Yeah, no problem. The list that Carly shared was amazing, and so glad those things are available to me and others. So great list. And of course, NAMI, we've talked a lot about. I'll just mention 2 others. There's a handbook called A Handbook for Survivors of Suicide by Jeffrey Jackson. The handbook is powerful in that it is short and meaningful. And again, recurring theme, when you're as scattered in your grief as most people are, find something small enough, bite-sized, powerful that helps you. And that helped me a lot. There's a particular page in the handbook called the Suicide Survivor's Affirmation, and it gives you the right to enjoy your life as the legacy to your loved one. It's beautiful. I printed it and put it on the refrigerator. And then the last thing I'll just mention is a book that I did read cover to cover called No Time to Say Goodbye, Surviving the Suicide of a Loved One by Carla Fine. What I liked about it is that it makes you feel less alone. And my particular journey has felt lonely. So from that standpoint, it was a good resource.
As we come to the end of our time, I just want to see if there are any closing comments, final points, or advice that you'd want to offer to our listeners. Leslie, how about we start with you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for putting this together, doing the good work that you do. Both you and Carly are amazing women in the community, helping people, and I applaud you for that and thank you. In closing remarks, would just like to say empathy, I think, is going to be my word of the year, and trying to understand it more and trying to find ways to embrace it, share it, and teach it. NAMI's been doing a class for junior high and high school age students on sort of mental illness 101. And there's a notion that you're born with empathy, and sometimes we just lose it. And I would love to see the next generation keep that as an innate character trait more than perhaps some generations have. So embrace empathy, understand that time is a fascinating thing. Grief isn't something gotten through. It's something you build a resilience to live with. And then lastly, just sort of the concept of integrating the grief into your life instead of focusing on the loss, figuring out how to bring Ben's memories into my current life in ways that are meaningful to me. I'll be making a carrot cake on his birthday every year, and now I'm going to be looking forward to his birthday and not lamenting another year that he didn't get to be here.
Carly, any closing comments or things that you'd want to leave our listeners with?
I hate to follow Leslie because that was so beautiful, and I do agree with you that empathy is really the beginning and the end and the circle that we need. And I do think the new generation is on the way. Beyond grief, I would say I encourage people to remember that whatever your thoughts, beliefs, experiences, opinions about suicide, it's a public health issue that affects us all. And we can help one another to live through some of the hardest things in our lives if we're just willing to talk about it. And that will go a long way. I encourage people to go to the Know the Signs website, learn the warning signs for suicide, learn the resources in your community to reach out for help. Be willing to ask for help if you need support. Know that if you feel this way, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not a bad person. You're a human being. It's something we go through, and everybody needs help sometimes. I encourage people to, on the community level, advocate for suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention efforts. These are safety resources that we need in order to ensure that we aren't dying from emotional or mental health issues, that we can keep one another safe through a crisis and see what comes on the other side of that. So I encourage people to be aware, vote in support of evidence-based policy making, get involved in your local suicide prevention coalition. And when you encounter someone who's in pain, instead of trying to take away that pain, let them have it and sit with them. Deborah, thank you so much. And Leslie, thank you for sharing today.
And thank you both for being here and talking about this very important and commonly held experience. Earlier in the show, we heard about suicide loss from the perspective of a parent. Now we hear from a listener who, as an adult child, lost her parent to suicide. We don't always consider the long arc of grief or how enduring and complex it can be, especially after a suicide loss. This next audio piece gives voice to that ongoing experience. It was written by a woman who, even after many years, still finds it too painful to speak publicly about her loss. To honor her privacy, she's chosen to remain anonymous. Her words are brought to life by reader Christine Barrington.
I am a woman in my 60s. I lost my mom to suicide in my late 20s, almost 40 years ago. More of my life has been lived without her than with her. Her death was the first time I'd ever experienced the death of anyone close to me, and because I was young, none of my peers had experienced it either. Most didn't know how to support me. After all, my friends had never been through it, and grieving after suicide is complicated. So in Santa Cruz, where I lived at the time, support for my loss was minimal. Only after a couple of months, one coworker even told me to get over it. Nobody around me understood how long the grieving process would be, and neither did I. Instinctively, in the few years after her death, I sought out some of the older adults in my parents' community in another state. Most important were my mother's closest friends, people who had known her for many years. They'd known me when I was a little child and loved both of my parents. The connection with those elders was critical for me, and we remained close until they passed away of old age. Back in Santa Cruz, in the first few years after she died, I craved being around older adults, perhaps as a parental replacement, and I even joined a congregation to connect with the generation older than me. It was a resource I'm glad I explored. It had other redeeming qualities over the years, but it didn't provide the same kind of support as connecting with my parents' friends. I'm very selective who I talk with about this. I came to realize that for people who didn't know my mother, their knowledge of her starts with a suicide and all the judgments attached. But for the people who knew and loved her before her death, although it ended tragically, it's not the sum total of their years of friendship with her. Now, fast forward almost 40 years, grief can come and go for both happy and sad times. I've missed my parent most of all at happy milestones in my life, including my wedding and the birth of my child, and especially not being able to share the joys of my parenthood. I've lived a good life, had a successful professional life, but when I recently lost another family member, the grief was an intense reminder of the grief decades ago. Supporting a friend after her mother's suicide brought back my grief. So various events, good and bad, can re-trigger your old grief. One thing that has been surprising to me is that when people talk about the complexities of taking care of an elderly parent, I feel a sense of relief. Whew, I don't have to deal with that. Another thing that stands out is that when I reached the exact age my mom was when she died, I felt an undescribable feeling, kind of like I'm in new territory and I have no model for living beyond this age. I came to recognize that much of what I experienced over the years has been post-traumatic stress or PTSD. Realizing this helped me make better sense of some of my emotions. For anyone else who may also be grieving a loved one lost to suicide, here are my thoughts. Spend time with the loved ones of the person who died. Know that grief will come and go throughout your life for happy and sad times. Find someone to talk with, a friend, therapist, or through a community organization who understands what you're going through and can support you.
Our deepest thanks goes out to this contributor for sharing her story, and to Christine Barrington, who served as the reader. You've been listening to State of Mind. being human and living well.
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 A heartfelt thank you to our guests today, Carly Memoli and Leslie Nielsen, for their courage in sharing such a personal and difficult conversation. And thanks to you for listening and being part of this essential dialogue. We encourage you to also listen to episode 34, Suicide Prevention for Teens and Young Adults, which complements today's conversation. And to learn more, explore the helpful resource list posted with the show notes at www.stateofmindmedia.org. We hope this episode has helped deepen your understanding of suicide loss and that you feel a bit more prepared to support someone navigating this kind of grief or to talk more openly about suicide and mental health. If you found today's show helpful, you may also want to check out Episode 7, A Story of Hope After Suicide and Loss, and Episode 27, A Toolkit for Navigating a Mental Health Crisis. New episodes of State of Mind are released the first Sunday of every month, and you can find our complete archive at stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of today's episode, or you just want to hear it again, be sure to subscribe to the State of Mind podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please, could you take a moment to rate and review the show? Your feedback not only supports us, it helps others discover these important conversations and find the support or insight they might be looking for. We want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. Share your story by submitting it in your voice recording. Just call in or record a short audio clip on your phone. Tell us about a mental health experience, a recovery insight, or a resource that's been helpful to you. Your voice may just be featured in a future episode. Submission details can be found at stateofmindmedia.org. Special thanks to our team, Vijay Luca and Jeannie Baldakowski for audio production, Yusuf Hassanin for audio production and volunteer coordination, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Ranton Hui, Ronnie Wong, and Tanmai Kadamani for transcriptions, Priscilla Yee for graphic design, Nimalan Ellen Chauvin for marketing, Lon Tron for data management, Jennifer Young, Heather Franks, and Katrina Tattenham for research. And special thanks to musician Adrian Legg and Favored Nations Entertainment for our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in partnership with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. Join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.